for. While the exact wording of the proposals is still to be provided by government, our focus at ADMA and here today is on how the Reformed Act will impact data-driven marketing, ensuring the industry understands what is happening, is clear on what it means, and what they need to do to be compliant with the new rules. Today's session will be kicked off with ADMA's Director of Regulatory and Advocacy, Sala Fernando, who many of you will already know. Sala is one of the most knowledgeable experts in the field of regulation in the marketing and data space, and she will help you frame your understanding of what is happening with the Privacy Act. Following this, Sala will be joined for a discussion with expert panellists Louis Martin, one of our ADMA Regulatory and Advocacy Working Group members, and the General Manager of Privacy and Customer Trust at Wesfarmers One Digital, and Kate Bauer, Consumer Data Advocate from Choice, as we bridge the gap between what marketers and consumer advocates hope to see with the reform. As an industry association, ADMA is committed to providing Australian marketers with the updates and resources needed to help expand their breadth of knowledge, both now and into the future. We know that these are really complex issues, and many marketers are not ready for the changes that are likely to take shape. Therefore, this session is designed to help marketers better understand what is to come so that we can all take that knowledge, tool, and resources and prepare for the road ahead. Another key part of the work that we do at ADMA is advocacy. And for us, advocacy means strengthening the voice of marketers in the developing digital economy, making sure marketers are suitably equipped for their voice to be strong in their businesses, with boards, and among their peers. We're here to champion the interests of our industry on all fronts. This means pushing for balanced regulations that provide consumer protection in a way in which the marketing sector can operationalise it, whilst also giving the consumer an optimal experience, because ultimately that's something they have come to expect. We aim to bridge the gap between what regulators are asking for and what marketers need to do, ensuring that our members are well prepared to handle changes effectively. Privacy is crucial in building trust in today's digital world, and ADMA firmly believes in protecting consumers whilst also championing businesses to use data responsibly. ADMA's commitment to the industry remains strong. We know the landscape is always changing, and with it, the challenges and opportunities for marketers. Our role is to provide a stable support system that our members can rely on. So thank you for joining us today. I look forward to a really productive and insightful session, and I'll now hand over to Sala.
Thank you, Andrea. Hopefully everyone can hear me okay. Welcome to today's quick overview before we get into the panel conversation. So just a reminder that, we're no longer in times where data is in silos in businesses. So data that marketing collects is actually important to the entire business. It drives the decision-making that goes right across the supply chain of a business, which is why it's really important and why we're all here today. So the data-driven marketing, and the reason why marketers are here today, is because you are at the front line of the collection, use, and disclosure of data. So there are three key sources of data. You've got business operations data, customer data, first party, and then you've got third-party data, which is made up of customer and business operations data. Now, that information comes to your business in a few different ways. It could be volunteered by your customer directly. It could be observed data. It could be inferred or derived, which might be insights, or it could be acquired, which might be from partners or from third parties. Now, the kind and type of data that you would collect in a business would be personal data, engagement data, behavioural and attitudinal. And the reason, once you put all that together, the way that you will see marketing use it is in these various ways in your day-to-day operations. So regulators, once the digital economy becomes a little bit mature, start to look and focus on how that economy is using things like data. And what that does is it means it starts the investigations that we are seeing with the privacy reform. However, those are just the words, okay? The development of the law is the words. What's important for us as industry and to ensuring compliance is to ensure that we know how to apply those words. And what we find is that when the law changes, it also changes the marketing landscape in which we're operating. So all those activities that you just saw on the slide before will start to change as well based on the definitions and the way that the law is reformed. Now, a lot of you might have heard that your businesses have invested a lot of time and money into cybersecurity. Now, that's not necessarily the same as privacy, and it's really important to know that distinction. Data security is focused on protecting the personal data, and it's focused on ensuring that you mitigate the risk within your business. But on the other side of that, it's really important for a business to focus on the use and governance of the personal data that you're collecting, ensuring that you're collecting the right data and that you're using it in the way that can do all of those decision makings that we spoke about in that first slide. That's why it's really important to ensure that, yes, you invest in data security on your tech side and your cybersecurity side, but it's also really important to ensure that you are investing money into upskilling, training, and understanding how to apply your privacy responsibilities in the department that drives growth, which is often marketing. So now we have a quick look at the developing privacy law. So in 1988, when the Privacy Act was created, it was introduced at a time where data, the data insights, and the ways in which we collect data was used it and disclosed it was very different to the way it is now. The objects of the Privacy Act would have been similar as they are today, but the kind of data available, the amounts of data, the way in which we collected it, used it, disclosed it, and managed it would have been vastly different. The scope of the Act, although suitable for those times and that kind of information, needed to, it created a sense of uncertainty because there were these new identifiers that nobody quite knew whether they were within scope or without scope. And what we find is most responsible marketers would have intended on trying to do the right thing, but when they didn't actually know whether something fit into a definition or scope, they'd likely keep it out, and that would lead to a lot of breaches. So there was a lot of uncertainty in the way that the Act that was drafted that many years ago would apply in today's environment. So as you can see, there was an absolute need to develop and reform this Act so that it could apply in today's environment. So the process of this Privacy Act review has been a long and considered one. There's been very much consultation throughout the entire process with the government, with industry, with all different parties that are key stakeholders to this. And what we found last year, at the end of the year, around September, the government published the last publicly seen version of the proposals that it intended to move forward with. Okay, now at that stage, there were some that were agreed in principle, and others that were noted. The agreed in principle ones were the ones that the government intended on focusing on to move forward into the Privacy Act reform. Now, what's next in Privacy Act reform? Since then, what we found was the government held a cost-benefit analysis, which was basically trying to work out whether or not these proposals, when operationalised, whether or not the cost or the benefit would kind of work out to be what was desired. Now, in that process, there was some definition, the definitions evolved a little bit. They're still not set in stone, okay, because the government still needs to decide, but they did kind of evolve just to be able to see what it would look like operationally. And what we know is that in the spring setting of Parliament, the government intends on putting forward a draft bill of the proposals, and then some point after that, that bill will become law. And once it becomes law, we know then that there will begin a transitional period where businesses will then have to ensure that they transition according to the new Act and that they are compliant by the end of it. Now, that period of time is going to involve a lot of work, okay? And no matter what it is, whether it's 12 months, 24 months, whatever it is, might sound like a lot of time, but there is a lot for a business to do, no matter who you are. So let's take a look at some of the things that we know are going to change. Look, we don't know the exact words, but we don't need to know the exact words. These are some things that we're absolutely sure of. We are sure that the scope of the Act is going to broaden, okay? It's going to apply to more types of data. The definition of personal information will broaden just by the definition of personal information, changing one word. The word about, which used to be about me. So, for example, Sala Fernando is about me, and now it's moving to relates to. That's how you can see all those other identifiers that we saw before have now been captured because those relate to me. They may not necessarily have always been about me. So there you can see automatically the definition of personal information is going to include a lot more of the data that we're using as businesses. Another thing is that the definition of the word collection, okay, it's going to expressly cover PI, that personal information that was inferred or generated. What that means is collected doesn't always mean when you're getting it from your consumer directly. It could even be when you generate or create insights about someone. That becomes collected. So again, there you can see the broadening. Then you've got some definitions are going to become a little bit more fluid. Where they used to be static, and you could say they do or they don't actually apply. Now it might be depending on the context within which that definition kind of sits. And then we're going to find that some exemptions, the actual act is going to apply to more businesses and circumstances that may have previously been left out of the scope. Now, there are going to be new definitions that are actually included in the actual act, which weren't there before. So as I mentioned before, de-identified information and sensitive information is moving to be a bit more fluid, right? So de-identified information, when something was classified as de-identified information initially, it would be outside the scope. Okay. Now, what they're saying now is it depends on the context within which it is. If it's possible that it's able to be re-identified, then that may mean that it becomes, it stays within the scope. Now, what that means is clean rooms could look very different. So in the past, we could assume that once information is de-identified and it goes into a clean room for you to share, that actually it might be outside of the scope or it might have different responsibilities. Now, the thing is that might actually change. So you're going to start looking at what your clean rooms, whether or not they have the requirements to keep information de-identified, because data is when you share data, it is very possible to have it re-identified. Now, before, children were not actually defined within the Act. The Privacy Act would apply to all people equally. They're looking at covering children and vulnerable people as well. Now, the one that really matters to a lot of marketers here is the introduction of these three terms: direct marketing, trading, targeting, and targeted advertising. Now, these we saw introduced in the proposals that were published in September, the government's responses. There have been a few tweaks to that. And what's happened is what you may not have seen previously, which the government did kind of introduce in some roundtables for the cost-benefit analysis, was the definition of targeted advertising. And that's quite significant because targeted advertising, being different to targeted then relates to the next thing that we've seen kind of reintroduced, and that was the reintroduction of the opt-out of targeting, but revised. Okay, and again, this was only introduced for the cost-benefit analysis, but we can see here how this has an impact if it is actually applied in the final version of the Act. Now, what's been included is the possibility of an opt-out of receiving targeted advertising. Okay, now a big difference from what we saw in September was back then, the opt-out was if someone chose to opt out of receiving targeting from you, you actually had to continue to provide them the business and service. What's happened now is if someone opts out of receiving targeted advertising, a business does not, so long as it's still fair and reasonable, need to continue to provide the service for someone. Okay, now that kind of makes a little bit more sense if you put it into the context of customer loyalty programs. And another change that we saw was where previously it said that targeting using sensitive information would be prohibited. It is now going a little bit more in line with the Spam Act, which you'd be familiar with, which is kind of saying, well, if it is sensitive information, you need to make sure that you have the consent required to target using that sensitive information. So that's along lines of what we're used to as marketers. There are some other key responsibilities that have been introduced into the Act and put forward as proposals, and a really big one is something that is it's unique to Australia, and that is the introduction of a fair and reasonable test. Now, basically what this is it's sort of like an overarching test that says no matter what you do, you have to make sure that your collections, use and disclosure of personal information is required to be fair and reasonable in the circumstances. Now, that test will apply irrespective of whether consent has been obtained. All right. So in the past, we used to be able to say, look, if you have the consent from your consumer, you can pretty much be certain that they are that you can use that data. Moving forward, this is actually saying, well, only if it meets that fair and reasonable test. Now, this is something that's different to the GDPR, okay? And this is why when a lot of businesses think that they've kind of gone through the processes and got the consent you need under GDPR, well, this is a new thing that Australia's kind of added to say, well, we also have to meet this overarching test. Along with those responsibilities, we can actually find there's a lot more responsibility to be transparent in the way that you operate and your notices. We also have to be a lot more transparent in the way that we tell people if we're planning to use automated decision making. Now, that's really important as marketers because it means that we're going to have to change the way in which we think. As marketers, we used to kind of operate in the kind of sphere that says we'll collect all the data that we want and then we'll work out how we're going to use it. Well, we can't do that anymore. Because of the transparency requirement, it means that we need to think ahead and let people know how we're planning to use that data. Now, with all of that responsibility, it means our accountability has also gone up. In the past, we might have thought, oh, look, regulators only ever go after the big platforms. We're okay. Well, no, the accountability is going to go up because there's been an introduction of the new direct right of action. And what that means is we're going to see that they can go directly to the court. Now, they may not have the money to go directly. Your customer may not, on their own, have enough money to go to a court with a complaint of a breach. But the thing is, law firms might decide to bring class actions of a bunch of your customers against something if they feel that you've been in breach or you haven't met your transparency or any of the requirements of the Act. So this new direct right of action will bring more eyes on your business. There's new rights of access that you have to explain to both the customers and regulators what you're doing. And we all know that if we give the opportunity of customers to explain, they will challenge you on what you've said. Okay, so that's going to bring more eyes on our businesses. Notifiable data breach up until now is if you have a data breach, you must, within a reasonable amount of time under the current Act, notify the regulators and your customers who are impacted, seriously impacted. But now that's going to change to say, well, no, between 72 hours of this data breach, you need to notify. And of course, there's increased regulator powers. And that all comes into play along with the fact that the increase in penalties have already taken place. This is already in play. All right. So the increase in penalties have already gone up from 2.22 million to the greater of what you can see on the screen there. I'm going to draw your attention to the last point there, which says 30% of a company's adjusted turnover in the relevant period. What that could mean if you have serious or repeated offences, and say you've had your data sitting in, sitting kind of untouched legacy data for 10 years, and then you have a data breach which involves that data, it could be 30% of your adjusted turnover for that 10-year period. So all of a sudden, if you think we don't have time and money to invest in training for privacy, well, you don't have time or money not to get across this. Now, all of this is kind of happening and it's quite overwhelming, and it's all happening not in silo. There's so much happening in our industry right now. All of this sort of stuff that you can see on the screen is happening at the same time as privacy changes. Now, that would intend that a lot of the time marketers might turn around and say, well, okay, we'll just wait until the Privacy Act actually has its reform. And once it does, we will then we'll start then. Well, you can see in the transitional period, there is so much that needs to get done, and that stakeholder assessment should have begun now. If you haven't begun starting to look inside your business and starting to prepare for what needs to come, then you are going to not be able to meet your compliance requirements by the end of the transitional period. You will be getting a handout which will give a little bit more detail as to what your business can do in that stakeholder assessment time, which you should be doing now. Okay, now we're going to prepare soon for a panel discussion. And I've just stopped sharing the screen. I think you guys should be having okay, you should be seeing that there was a poll that's on the screen for you guys to answer. How would you rate your understanding of the upcoming privacy reform changes? Just take a look and see. Give you guys a couple more seconds to. Okay, so I'm going to end that poll now. And most people on here have between limited understanding of the changes and a moderate understanding of the changes. Now, that is not surprising because they're very complex and it is difficult. It is difficult even for people who spend all their time basically reading this stuff, even on weekends. And yes, I'm one of those people. And to join me today to help discuss and maybe help us kind of weave through this, I'm very, very pleased to introduce my two panelists. Sorry, just going to make sure that. Okay, joining me on screen today, we've got Louis Martin, General Manager of Privacy and Customer Trust at Wesfarmers One Digital and a member of ADMA's Regulatory and Advocacy Working Group. Louis Martin is the General Manager of Privacy and Customer Trust at Wesfarmers One Digital. He's a foundation member of the team that established Wesfarmers' newest division, which brings together the group's digitally native businesses, including the OnePass membership program, the Catch Marketplace, and the One Data Advanced Analytics teams and data assets. His remit includes privacy, data governance, risk and compliance, responsible AI, legal, corporate affairs, sustainability, and First Nations affairs. Louis' previous roles at Wesfarmers ranged from data and digital policy to sustainability and Indigenous affairs, plus time in the Wesfarmers legal team, where he worked on a range of data and digital initiatives, including establishing the Flybuys joint venture between Wesfarmers and Coles. He's also a member of the National AI's Centre Responsible AI Think Tank and Standards Australia IT-043 AI Standards Committee. Welcome, Louis. And joining us as well is Dr. Kate Bauer, who many of you I'm sure would know. She is the Consumer Data Advocate at Choice, Australia's largest consumer advocacy organisation, where she leads advocacy on privacy reform, facial recognition technology, and AI regulation. She spent 6 months as the first HTI Fellow at UTS Human Technology Institute, working on the future of AI regulation. She has a PhD from the University of Technology, Sydney, and a Bachelor of Arts with honours from the University of New South Wales. Kate is a member of the National AI Centre's Responsible AI Think Tank and Standards Australia IT-043 AI Standards Committee. Welcome to both Louis and Kate. Thank you so much for joining us here today as well. I'm so excited about the conversation that we're going to have. As you would have all seen, it was an absolute power through some of these changes that we are seeing. And so I'm hoping that we can kind of unpack some of that for today's audience. So welcome very much. And yeah, welcome. Okay, what I'm going to start with is I'm going to throw to both of you. I'm going to throw the same question to both of you. Why do you think the privacy reform changes matter for brands and consumers? And maybe to begin this, I might go to Louis.
Yeah, thanks, Sarah. Look, I think they really matter for both of those segments. And so I think as you indicated in your great presentation, the Privacy Act changes will bring a much broader coverage. So more types of data, they'll impact more businesses and more circumstances relevant to marketing. They'll also give more control to consumers and put more power in the hands of consumers to take action if those consumers think that that their data is being mishandled. And I think in that context and the breadth of the changes that you outlined, I think there's a real risk of getting overwhelmed. So if we sort of step back as marketers or brands, I think it's a real opportunity for those brands who engage well to become more transparent and more considered around how they're going to use data, to really focus on giving the most relevant, timely marketing communications that they can, to make sure there's a fair value exchange for asking for a consumer's data and then making sure that they use that responsibly. I think if they do all of that, they'll become differentiated in the market as a responsible custodian of customer data who actually gives the consumer the marketing that they want at the time and in the channel that they want it. Again, as you indicated as well, this requires, the changes may come in a couple of years, but it requires some investment in focus now. And none of that investment will be wasted. So again, some of it's pretty simple stuff that we should already be getting on with. So it's, do you know where your data is? Do you know where and how you got it? How long are you allowed to keep it for? When do you need to get rid of it? How are you thinking about how that might impact your contact strategy, your marketing, so you shift between branded, performance, one-on-one or contextual? And then also, how do you engage across your teams, right? So are you siloed, or do you not have a team? Yep. So if you're siloed, how do you break down those barriers between privacy and compliance and MarTech? If you don't have a team, how are you coming to more of these sessions and actually trying to eat, the elephant one piece at a time? And you can start that by doing a maturity assessment, validating where your data is, looking at your people, process, and tech, and developing just an incremental work plan. So I think it's doable, but I wouldn't wait.
Fantastic. And Kate, why do you think these privacy reform changes matter for a consumer?
So I think we've noticed over the last couple of years, privacy, I think previously people kind of treated privacy as not something they spent a huge amount of time thinking about. And I think we've seen over the last couple of years that has significantly changed for most consumers. Part of that has been the large number of quite large data breaches that we've had in Australia. And certainly I think there's been an increasing awareness of the environment of our kind of data-driven, whether that's the kind of ideas of targeting and profiling, and certainly the rise of social media. People have become much more aware of what the scope of that information sharing is like. But I just think one thing I think sometimes industry misses is that they're quite focused on the compliance for their business and often don't kind of think back to the bigger picture of why do we even have a Privacy Act? And that is to protect and promote the privacy of individuals. So I'll just kind of walk you through from the consumer's perspective of kind of what it feels like to exist in our digital world currently. So, if you're an ordinary consumer, you're dealing with things like potentially going to go see, your favorite concert or a football game and dealing with facial recognition technology being used in the stadium, potentially without your knowledge. We've got things like domestic violence perpetrators using access to smart fridges to abuse their victims. We've got things like photos of people on the toilet collected from vacuum cleaners somehow ending up on the internet. We've got intimate information on things like our fertility tracking apps or our mental health apps being packaged and then on-sold to advertisers without people realizing that that's happening. We've got companies that have been holding data for decades, which then gets involved in a data breach. For example, in the case of Latitude, we had consumers contacting us who were previous customers of the previous business, GE Money, who had no idea that Latitude held their information, and then suddenly they're caught up in a data breach from a sofa that they bought 10 years ago. We've got really, really large data breaches happening, sometimes including quite sensitive information. The MediSecure one is just the latest example of that. And that included some quite sensitive information like health identifiers, prescription details, things that people definitely do not want to be out there, and certainly not on the dark web. We've seen examples of people like sick patients being told that they can't see their GP for free unless they they sign up to a loyalty program. And we've seen, even more recently, some AI companies and some social media companies just changing the terms and conditions to suddenly scrape people's private memories and their photos of their loved ones and their conversations to train large language models with no option to opt out. So I think that that's just some of the examples of some of the things that Choice has covered in the last couple of years. But for the consumers to be experiencing all of that at once, it really feels for them like they have no control over their privacy and they really feel unprotected. And that's why we've seen such a large shift in the amount of support for privacy reform. And I think why the government has really seen this as a necessary and understandably, it will be a big shift for business, but it's the kind of shift that has to happen in order for consumers to have that feel that their privacy is protected and promoted, which is the purpose of the Act in the first place. So I guess that's just like a little bit of an introduction from the consumer's perspective of what it feels like. And I think it's good sometimes to be reminded of that because quite frequently people within individual teams, understandably, are focused on just what their business is doing. But this is happening in an environment where customers are experiencing all of these risks and the threats at once. And that's the framework from which they'll be interacting with your business. So I'm totally in agreement with Louis that you don't need to wait for law reform to happen. There are many, many things that people can do ahead of the reform, and they should do them because they're good for business, as well as will then make you more compliant in the future. So I think, regardless of knowing the detail, I think we can get very caught up in like the specifics. Is it going to be this proposal? Is the wording going to be this? Is definition going to be that? And I think certainly there will be a time when we need to be able to understand each element of the reforms. But I think two things are probably pretty clear. One, as you say, is that the scope of the Act is likely to change fairly significantly. That is something that you can prepare for today by knowing what data you have in your business and start to be thinking, well, actually, will this be covered by the scope of the Act? Even just that awareness piece and that auditing piece really is important regardless of when the reforms come into place. And then the second big shift, I think, which is important to act on now, is moving from what we call the notice and consent model of privacy to a circumstance where businesses are going to share much more of the burden and the responsibility for acting with data fairly and responsibly. And that's where that fair and reasonable use test comes in. So I think regardless of the specifics and regardless of when we anticipate that this reform process will happen, we will definitely be seeing a shift in both the scope and in where the responsibility and the liability is likely to fall. And those are two things I think that marketers can start to work on today.
Thank you. I think if I take what both of you have said, it's actually really overwhelming for both parties, right? For the consumer and for the business, because the changes that are coming all at once are very, very are huge for a business to kind of operationalize. And the chance of us not making these changes for a consumer is actually also overwhelming, because all of a sudden we're collecting data that might be in some ways insignificant, right? It could be publicly kind of available data. But then, as you mentioned, there's a lot more sensitive stuff that's also being considered. But at the end of the day, I think what kind of brings it back together, especially in the marketing department, is that understanding of consumer trust. All right. I think the need for reform has kind of come into play because of a lot of customers have lost trust in the digital practices of the businesses, right? They've trusted a business in a particular way, and they've kind of turned around and said, we trust you with our data. And then they've felt betrayed when they've had a breach. And quite often it's a bad actor that may have tapped into something, or there's a human error, or there's just the way that the Act is right now. And you made a point there, and I agree with you, the fact that things do need to be simple for the customer, because at the end of the day, they just want their data protected. They know the value of their data, and they want to ensure that when they hand it over to a business, that it is managed the way that they expect it and that they get the experience. But on the other side, for a business, that in order to provide that simplistic experience for a customer, there's a need to understand the intricacies and how each of the proposals, which in and of themselves do make sense, it's when they interplay with each other that becomes kind of difficult. And so I think there is some work for a business in understanding the intricacies on how to operationalize the new reforms in order to provide that seamless experience for a customer. And to that point, there's a new transparency requirement of businesses in order to put that responsibility onto the business away from the customer. Louis, can I ask you, what's your thoughts with that transparency requirement for a business, and what do you think that means for a business in order to shift the way it currently thinks to move to a model where we're a lot more transparent with the data that we're collecting and using?
Yeah, thanks, Salah. And I think sitting above all of that transparency is the concept of fair and reasonable. And I know I probably speak to that. I think she's got a really good way of actually framing that to make it simple to understand. But regardless of how transparent you are and how much you tell customers, I think the point that I think Kate and I both agree on is a lot of the onus is shifting back on the business, right? So just because you tell someone doesn't mean you can do it. So I think that's probably the first thing. And the fair and reasonable, you still need to satisfy that test about whether or not one of your customers is actually going to think, that you're reasonably going to expect to do this, what kind of information you're collecting. And that'll vary by industry. So with health, it might be more sensitive. You might have to sort of think about that differently from just has someone bought a T-shirt or whatever from a sort of a general merchandiser. When then, is it reasonably necessary for you? What are the risks of harm and things like that? And again, I'll let Kate's got a really good way of describing that, so I'll let her do that. And then I think once you've got past that, do you then go, well, when and how do I need to tell a customer or a potential customer about what I might do with their data? And to be honest, that can actually be quite hard now, because I think, as we know, is if we try and shift the burden to a customer to have to read a 14-page privacy policy as a transparency notice before they're signing up, that's not a great way to engage with our customer. So I know some of the things that I know a lot of brands are doing is, how do we actually do that in the moment in the simplest possible way that is contextual and makes sense for that customer? So I would like your date of birth. You can opt in or out of giving me that, and in return, I'll give you something which might be a special marketing comms or actually a package for your birthday. Some other brands are now asking, would you or would you not like to hear from us during Mother's Day? That might be a good time of year, or it might be a bad time of year. So that's a way of actually contextually asking people and giving them notice and telling them how you'll use their data in the moment. That is different from the traditional methods of relying on a large, relatively legalistic privacy policy or collection statement. The other thing about sort of transparency as well is, once you've collected the data, you're being transparent with how you're going to use it and the controls that you're giving a customer. So think about what is your preference center look like? What level of sophistication do you want to actually give control to customers once they've actually accepted that they will get your data? Is it channel? Is it frequency? Is it category? Or is it event driven? Do you want to go through progressive profiling? So as they learn to trust you more and you actually give them better value for the personalization that you're giving you, they may be actually more open to sharing that data with you, again, because they trust you as a particular brand. So I think, again, with this, there's a few layers to it as well. But I think, as you you still need to go through the fair and reasonable test effectively, and then you work out how and when you engage with a customer and how transparent you can be through the different mechanisms we've just talked about.
Hey, would you like to add anything to that before?
Yeah, I mean, I think transparency is a necessary a part of the process. I think that example that Louis gave there around that contextual question asking is, we think about the relationship with between marketers and customers as one that we need to build trust in, and then we start thinking about our customers as humans first, rather than data points first. I think that really lends itself to that kind of thinking. So I think the difference in this is that kind of contextual question, for example, asking, would you like to hear from us around Mother's Day or not, is, I think, a much more human-focused approach than, say, taking some information that about people and dumping in them in a segment called dead parents. or something like that. So rather than just saying we know inferred information and we'll just segment people under these kinds of segmentation, is actually thinking about what is the relationship that we have with our individual customers and how can we do that in a way that is respectful and transparent, and offer that. I understand, like obviously certainly the business that Louis is coming from is a large one which can have a sophisticated preference center, and certainly not every type of business, and I see there's already a kind of number of questions here around nonprofits, is going to have that level of sophistication available to them. But I think the principle still holds. And I do think that we need to understand transparency in the context of that fair and reasonable use test. And the thing that Louis was referring to is I like to talk about the fair and reasonable use test, which I think is necessarily legalese in the description in the Act as the privacy pub test. Because I think that's something that kind of like brings it into reality for people. If you went and as a marketing person or as a data steward in your business went down to the pub and tried to explain to someone, hey, this is what I'm doing with the information that you tell me, and they go, ooh, that's a bit creepy, oh, I don't like that, you're probably not passing the privacy pub test and you're probably not acting fairly and reasonably. So I think one example of this, which I kind of alluded to earlier, was this example recently of Meta changing their terms and conditions to basically everything that is now on their platforms they will be using to train large language models. And for the people who are fortunate enough to live in the EU, have an opt-out as required under the GDPR. But for people in Australia, they've just said, sorry, take it or leave it. That when people interact with a service like Facebook or Instagram, many people, many users would have signed up, say, 12 years ago, 10 years ago, 15 years ago. I can remember what it was like back in the first heady days of social media. We're all poking each other and we're all talking like a pirate and, sharing everything, our intimate thoughts, what we had for lunch. There's really no way at that time that people could have anticipated that 15 years down the line, that information would then be used by that business in a technology that hadn't even been invented yet. Like that's a kind of a change where that would not be, I think, even if people had consented to it in the terms and conditions, that wouldn't pass the fair and reasonable use test. Because I think if you tell ordinary people, and certainly we got plenty of emails about it at Choice, from a lot of angry people who were frustrated that they felt like they didn't have any control. Really, the only option then would be to go and download everything off Facebook and Instagram and then delete your account and then miss out on sharing all of those memories and all of those interactions versus not. So, I think people have a reasonable expectation that, they click on something and, people actually have a pretty, I think, savvy understanding of how a digital marketing environment works. They know that the kind of things that they look at and the things that they click on or the things that they say that they like, that they're likely to see advertising that relates to that. People have varying different levels of comfort with how much profiling they're willing to accept, but people have a good understanding of that. To then move into a situation, say, where that information would be shared with other third-party platforms or would be used for entirely other purposes, like training large language models, that would be across the creepy line for most people. So I think of the privacy pub test as a kind of way, a simple way that you can start thinking through in a more human-centered way about what the fair and reasonable use test is actually likely to look like in your business.
Thank you. That's fantastic. I agree with what both of you have said there. And I think that's part of the you've done, poking that you did 15 years ago. All of that, that's not something that you can kind of see or that you'd accept. And I think part of this is regulatory change. Part of it is responsible for the law to actually evolve. The other part is for the actual marketers to change their practices, right? Because as you say, that line between what is okay to be, how it's okay to be targeted, and then kind of having something follow you around where it's creepy, that actually sometimes is not requirement of just the law. It's actually a requirement of marketers thinking about how they're using this data and if they absolutely have to use it in that way. And so I think this regulatory reform is going to change the way in which marketers have to think. And I think the fact that the transparency for the consumer is one thing, Having the transparency and letting your consumer know what you plan to do with the data is one thing, and it's responsible. But it's also going to change the marketer's way of thinking. All of a sudden, they're going to have to think far ahead. Are we planning to use automated decision making? Are we planning to collect data and build a profile on somebody, and then someday provide them with, different prices or withdraw certain offers or things like that? So I think there is going to be a fundamental shift on both sides, which will get us back to that, remembering that human beings are behind that data. It's not just data, it is human beings. And I think that's a really important part. So if we take a look at some of the other acts that are kind of sitting in the privacy space too, things like spam and things like that, the regulators are quite annoyed that it's taken 20 years and people are still making the same mistake. What do you think we're going to see with once the Privacy Act kind of reformed? What kind of things are we going to see with the transition? And then do we think that it's going to take businesses this long? Because as we just showed, the accountability is going up, the fines are going up, the accountability and the focus and the attention and the eyes on a business. Do you think, for example, fair and reasonable, that's a tough one. It's going to be very difficult. We can't say today what is going to be fair and reasonable, because what's fair to one person and reasonable to another. What have you got some commentary that both of you would like to kind of add to what we can expect to see over this period of time, especially if it's something that we don't have to match against the rest of the world with fair and reasonable? Louis, would you like to take this one?
I've gone first. I'm happy for Kate to go first. I've gone first.
Okay.
They're throwing that one to me. Yeah.
Okay.
Look, I certainly agree. I do think that fair and reasonable, it will be different than what we have seen elsewhere in privacy, but it's also not completely out of the blue. In Australia, there are other legal contexts in which we can look to, and particularly in financial services, where there's frequently a best interest duty that is applied to certain groups of financial advice providers, things like mortgage brokers and the like, have a best duty, and that's about shifting that responsibility to the business rather onto the individual. That's a similar kind of duty. So I think that there are places where we can look for what that might mean in practice, but more broadly in terms of like what we're likely to see in the shifting landscape. So you mentioned there's likely to be some kind of direct right of action for individuals, potentially a statutory tort. It's going to be easier for class actions to be brought, even though I will just flag that is also current under our current law. There are several class actions, for example, at the moment around recent data breaches. But we're also, and Choice has been pushing for a shift in the powers of the regulator. So you mentioned earlier that there is significant penalties that are there, but also what we have been pushing for is some, I guess, smaller powers to be attributed to the regulator. So things like infringement notices, things like tiered penalty systems, more investigative powers, so that the regulator can become, I guess, so we see someone more similar in powers to the ACCC or to ASIC, where they can have a more proactive approach to compliance and regulation. So kind of what we don't want to get to is a situation where we wait for the really bad thing to happen before the regulator is able to act, which is kind of where we've been, partly because the OAIC has been so under-resourced and really has not had the amount of the money required to even conduct the investigations that they are conducting, let alone be able to have a more proactive compliance approach. Ideally what we want to see is that these reforms to lead to a shift in the culture and a shift in the way that businesses think about privacy. And we need to see that shift towards data minimization. So part of the reforms are really about a cultural change towards data minimization and a more human-centered and privacy by design focused for each of the businesses interacting. So I think what we're going to see is, yes, I think there's potential, threatening actions from individuals or from regulators, and potentially from large law firms, always looking to make a buck while they're also fighting the good fight for privacy. But I actually think that all of those things combined hopefully lead to some more smaller compliance actions, better guidance from the OAIC on what individual businesses can do, some kind of warnings, so an infringement notice before you get to the federal court fine situation of saying people will be able to complain, people will be able to say, hey, I don't like that what's happening. The regulator can come in and say, give people a warning, give people a small infringement notice and say, look, you need to get this up to scratch, refer to our guidance here. So I do think, there's two ways to think about this here. I do think we need more avenues to lift compliance, but I also think what we need is a shift towards that data minimization, and that will be to benefit, I think, both consumers but also to businesses. The safest data that you have is the data that you don't hold, right? So this is really reducing the risk for businesses, while you also increase the privacy for individuals.
Is there anything you'd like to add to that, Louis?
I think one of the things, privacy law will continue to be a principles-led law, right? So there will be a bit of a shaking out process as people learn exactly how either the court or the regulator would think about that. But I still think, reinforcing what Kate said around sort of implementing privacy by design and data minimization is key. And to make it really practical, what is the purpose for which you need to get someone's birthday? And do you need their birthday, or do you need their birth month, or do you just need to cite a document that confirms it and tells you whether or not they're over 18? So again, it's what do you need it for? How long do you need to keep it for? And the purpose for which you're using it, and then get rid of it as soon as you don't need it. Yeah. The other element I think there is, we'd be looking forward to getting some really good practical guidance from the regulators. And I think you're seeing sort of ACMA starting to deliver that now, and the OAIC, as part of its transition period as well, because it will be transitioning into the brave new world. It will be producing guidance that actually gives you more clarity around what its view might be on what is fair and reasonable, what its view might be on the best way to minimize data or how to approach these things. And I think, the opportunity there is to make sure that guidance is fit for purpose, is really practical, and can be applied across not only sort of big business, not-for-profits, but small business that will now be caught by this. And I think the more that we can get and we can engage with the regulator and government on how we would like to see that guidance delivered, and ADMA is a key body to do that, as is Choice and other bodies around there, I think the better it will be as part of that transition period, and then as soon as the law goes live as well.
I think that's a really good point. So when this reform comes into play and the proposals are kind of put into law, it's really just the starting point, right? We've got such a responsibility to lean in and to provide the regulators with use case examples that exist in the real world, right? Because that's what's going to contribute to ensuring that guidance is actually useful in order to operationalize this and ultimately have the successful result for privacy reform that we've been working towards for so many years. I think that is actually really key. Looking at that, what about businesses that think that, two things, businesses that think, oh, we've gone through GDPR, so therefore we're, privacy ready. That fair and reasonable test, it's not something that you can just kind of overlay over the top, as you mentioned. But also that a lot of businesses that kind of say we've got this sorted because we've put our money into securing after the data breaches, into cybersecurity, and privacy is kind of covered in there. I've already said what I thought in the presentation. What are your thoughts from both of that? From a consumer point of view, Kate, and from a business point of view, Louis. I'm going to start. Can't remember who I started with last time. I'm going to start with you, Kate, because I think I threw and Louis threw back. So, Kate.
Yeah, I think I think the important thing to think about from the consumer side is they don't know the machinations of your business, right? They don't know which team is which. They don't know if you've got a marketing team and an IT team and whatever. All they know is the information that they've shared with you. They also don't know, for example, what kind of profiling or segmentation or what data that you've acquired from other sources. They don't know any of that. So all they know is that their relationship with you, the information that they know that they've shared with you, and then they trust you with that information. So from their point of view, that's the key factor. So it really doesn't matter if your cybersecurity team is up to scratch. They experience a privacy harm, and individual privacy harms are still important. So obviously, data breaches can be extremely harmful in the sense that information can fall into the hands of identity thieves, can lead to scam losses, can lead to all sorts of really, really, really bad outcomes for consumers. But we also get information and emails from consumers who've experienced just individual data breaches. So, for example, they might be on a phone conversation with a customer service representative, or they might be contacting the business in another way, and then they find out that some personal information that they thought was private has been shared. Information, for example, like we shared earlier in the Mother's Day example, that they've got a close family member that's recently passed away, or that they've got some sensitive health information that has reached a different part of the business that they weren't aware that was shared. Or, for example, information that they felt that they shared in the context of, say, getting a refund, then they get some targeted marketing from that business that obviously infers that information then was shared with the marketing part of the business. So those sorts of individual breaches of privacy are still important, and they still impact on consumers. And that's why I think it's important not just to think about privacy as a cybersecurity issue. Go back to those first principles of human-centered design, privacy by design, and start leading with, as Louis says, do we really need this information? Is this the kind of information that consumers would feel comfortable with us holding? And is this going to be the kind of information they feel comfortable with us using for other purposes than for which it was collected? And I think that's another way of thinking about that privacy pub test is, the Privacy Commissioner previously has been very clear on this point, that each new use is considered and needs to be considered. So it's not just we've collected the information and we've got consent for that information. You need to consider the consent and now also the fair and reasonable use test in every further use of that information. So it's not simply a matter of we've collected this data and it's ours now and we can do what we want with it. Every future use, and that's why that Meta example I think is a good one, needs to be considered in regards to the fair and reasonable use test or the privacy pub test, and as a new collection and use of data. And the Privacy Act will need to relate to each specific. And the Privacy Commission has been very specific about this, that even like a minute amount of a second, half a second collection is still a collection. So even if you delete it straight away, if you collected it all, it is a collection and it will be covered by the Privacy Act. And that is the case now. So I think people need to think very carefully about what that means for their business.
Louis, did you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, I think the only other sort of little points I'd add is cybersecurity is almost it's foundational, but it's not necessary. So it's So it's necessary, but it's not sufficient. So and I think the other element there is I think Kate said it really well about consumers trust you to, when they hand over their data, for you to protect it, and they sort of trust it in that response. They also assume that you're going to get rid of it, I think, as well, at a time when it's no longer relevant, and that might not be relevant because it's out of date. You've changed as a person, doesn't help your marketing, it doesn't actually help you with personalization, or just because the business no longer has another need for it. And I think that goes back again. I think we're sort of singing from the same hymn sheet on this about data minimization. So make sure you've got processes in place to get rid of it. So first, consider whether or not you need to collect it, and then make sure that you protect it while you've got it, and that you delete it as soon as you no longer need it as well, because that not only protects you, but it also protects your customers.
Fantastic. Okay, we've had a lot of questions that have been coming in, and I'm going to kind of group a couple of them in for this next question, just to kind of cover a few things. As brands, and Kate, you made a point of consumers are dealing with a brand, and at the end of the day, they're putting their trust in that brand, right? They've said, I trust you, and I'm passing my data over to you. But sometimes the brands need third parties to kind of either help out with managing their data, or they're getting data from third parties. I wouldn't mind us having a little bit of a chat about how these privacy reforms are going to change the way in which in the way in which businesses should be dealing with third parties. And the GDPR has that controller processor distinction that we don't know if it's coming into Australia. There's been suggestions in the last publicly released version of the proposals that there would be the introduction of a controller and processor, and just for this group of people, a controller will always be the brand, because that's who the business is trusting, and then the processor will be the relationship that the brand might have with a contractor or some terms that say you are supposed to do this with the data. This time I'm going to start with you, Louis, with what you think businesses are going to have to start thinking about in doing third-party data sharing, whether that's you're doing the activities for the business along the supply chain, or on top of that, data enrichment when we're sharing data.
Yeah, so I think some of this is sort of an extension of the things we should already be doing, right? Just because you've handed over data to someone as a subcontractor to either execute on a marketing campaign or to hold your data for you in a data platform or warehouse, doesn't mean that you have absolved yourself of the responsibility to make sure that you keep that data safe and you use it appropriately. So in terms of your third-party risk management and how you think about how you engage with your vendors, we should be taking that incredibly seriously now, and you should be thinking about that. And in fact, what you've often seen with some of the data breaches is the baddies often come in through the back door. They come in through the weakest link, which might be someone in your supply chain. So, that means I think you need to be careful about what data you share with them. Not only have you got a process to make sure that you're trying to engage with the right vendors, but you've also got the right contractual protections to make sure that you can get comfort or audit as well. And again, that if you think that you need to delete it, you need to make sure that they do the same thing, right? Because again, it goes down through the supply chain. And so I think even though there's this discussion about whether or not a controller or a processor might come in, this stuff still exists in the existing regime. And so this is an extension in some ways of that. I think in terms of data clean rooms and the like, I think given a couple of things, the element of fair and reasonable, some of the marketing controls that a customer will have, and also more granularity that'll be around de-identification and when that is. I think we're going to have a look at those concepts and also how they might play out. I think we still need probably a little bit more detail. That's probably an area we just need to see a little bit more about of the wording in the law to actually work out what that actually means and how we might need to redesign or stop some of those elements or actually reinforce some of the controls that we've got around there. But I think that is an area that we're going to need to look at. There will be more restrictions, and I think you've seen from some of the regulatory things that there has been the ACCC, I think from recollection, has looked at data brokers. So that is an area of movement. And I think, again, going back to what we've been talking about fair and reasonable and the pub test, are your customers going to expect that you have got a whole raft of other data about them from someone else, or that person has shared it with you? I think is one of the questions we'll need to face into.
There's been a few questions about how CDR, consumer data right, and other regulatory kind of the impacts on that. I think it's an important point for us to kind of speak to the fact that this process has taken quite a while because there are, not competing, but there are different kind of regulatory regimes that are having to work in hand with each other. And we know that the regulators meet up on a regular basis now to kind of discuss. We've got the OAIC, the ACCC, the E-Safety Commissioner, and the ACMA in that digital space. So I think these privacy reforms, and please, either of you, please jump in here, but I think these privacy reforms are going to move more in line with trying to keep a consistent view as to what personal information actually is. And I think that's going to be required because anyway, a customer who's operating in an open banking scheme is going to have that same expectation as to how their data should be used when they go over to a retailer anyway. So I think, is there anything that either of you would like to add just to help the people who have asked questions about how this is going to kind of interplay? Anything that either of you would like to add on that, kind of considering how the different varying regulations that we have to operate within in a business will play together in this privacy reform?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with what you said there, Sala, but also with what Louis referred to there, because I think it is an area where we will likely need to see a little bit more detail to fully understand. Certainly in the ACCC's report on data broking, there is more focus on some of those practices of what they're calling data firms are not necessarily just data brokers. I think many that would capture many businesses within the marketing area of marketing industry, what they're referring to as data firms. And I think practices like data clean rooms, and I see there's a couple of questions about hashed emails as well. The scope of what's considered private personal information will be expanding. We don't perhaps know, it is likely to still be principles based, but also then have some specific examples in the Act that help define that information. But I think what we've seen over time is that the original definition, whether or not, certainly Anna Johnston would gladly have an argument with many people about this, about what the current interpretation of the Act is or should be, but certainly in practice, the scope has been defined quite narrowly, so that many things are not currently captured by the Act, which I think most consumers would regard to be personal information. We have not quite published it yet, but I'll give you a little bit of a sneak peek, as we recently asked consumers what kinds of things that they consider to be personal information, and there was quite high support for things like unique customer identifiers, other types of even inferred data, was over 50% of people thinking that inferred generated data is something that can identify them. So I think realistically, the industry will need to start looking more closely at the operations of some of the ways that data is shared currently between businesses and third parties. And some of those practices will need to stop. I'm not necessarily, because I haven't seen the detail of the legislation, not necessarily able to kind of say exactly, but I do think that there will be some things that are currently happening that will no longer be compliant, but it's not something that I think people will know until we actually see what that information is. Like in terms of the regulatory environment more broadly, again, it really does go down to the less information you're holding and for less time, the simpler compliance between regimes becomes. So back to those first principles of data minimization and privacy by design will put you in the best possible position, regardless of where any of the future compliance regimes end.
Anything you want to add, Louis, or?
Just sort of almost with a consumer hat on for the CDR, I think one of the good things that it does do, and I don't know the scale at which it's been adopted, but I know that I've sort of done it, is it's very express and very clear as to, I want to take some of my banking data out of another bank and share it with X bank to get a better mortgage rate or to refinance or to do something. So it's very clear what the value exchange is, the mechanism to do it. And actual fact, that's quite a good thing. That may be a model that other businesses want to adopt, whether or not the CDR applies, actually being that clear and expressed to going, if you do want us to either get your data from someone else or to share it, this is the value that we will give you, and it's an opt-in, and therefore the consumer is empowered. You know exactly where you stand as a brand, and you've got more data. Hopefully it's richer. It actually enables you to give a better, more relevant, targeted, timely offer to your customer as well, and you continue to build that trust.
And I think that's a key point that both of you made. Regardless of the actual wording and the definition, the customer expectation with things like the CDR and the things with other regulatory movement and reform has changed what the expectation is on business anyway. So regardless of whether you're required to, it's best practice to do it. Which kind of brings me to a number of other questions here about small business and other exemptions. Look, we know that the government have kind of spoken and had quite a bit of consultation on the small businesses exemption being removed. Where they stand on that currently, I don't think anybody knows completely until they give their next public release. However, there is a notion that given, especially with COVID and the amount of data that people have had to hand over during that period in signing in and checking in, there's a lot of businesses, small businesses, that would have collected a lot of data that they may not necessarily have thought about or wanted to collect previously. So I think in a point to that, instead of focusing necessarily on the exemptions and whether you have to meet the floor of the law, all right, the law being the ceiling, I think this is a mindset and an opportunity for marketers to raise their standards for businesses to raise their standards of best practice and to put best practice into play, because I think at the end of the day, that's what we should be aiming for. The law is going to set the floor. The law is going to tell us what we absolutely must do in order to not get a slap on the wrist. But again, as things evolve, our consumers' expectations are going to go higher than the level of the law ever, right? Because that's going to move the technology, the standards that people expect, their understanding of the value of their data, their understanding that, I mean, businesses today can't say that they own data anymore. They're having to understand that they are custodians of this data. So is there anything that either of you would like to say in relation to those exemptions, whether it be small business or research or any of those sort of things? Is there anything?
Yeah, Choice has been quite vocal in our support for removal of the small business exemption, and that's pretty simple, really, is that consumers don't care the size of the business. They just want their data to be protected. They just want to know that their privacy rights are protected. They will have no idea. I mean, the moment it's a $3 million turnover is the description. Customers have no clue what the turnover of the business is, and they don't want to know that their rights are different depending on the turnover of business. It makes no sense from the consumer's point of view. That said, also, some small businesses collect a huge amount of information on people, and some collect very little. So when we did our report into the rent tech sector, for example, rent tech companies, 2/3 of real estate agents are considered small businesses under the Privacy Act. But I think anyone who's had to undergo a rental application process realizes the huge amount of information that is collected during that process, and consumers quite rightly expect for the Privacy Act to apply for those sorts of things. On the other hand, potentially your hairdresser doesn't know all that much about you. They might just have your first name and your phone number. And so, we understand that small businesses potentially are hugely different. Like, they're hugely varied and they're hugely diverse. What Choice wants to see is a more privacy protective environment across the economy. And so for that reason, we're very supportive of the removal of the exemption, but we'd also like to see more resources and given to the regulator to be able to provide the right guidance so that small businesses feel like that they can be compliant. The best outcome here is that small businesses are more privacy compliant, that they uplift those protections for individuals. That's the best outcome for consumers, and it's the best outcome for small businesses and the economy more broadly. So we're certainly not looking to remove the exemption as a way to suddenly ping your hairdresser with a $50 million fine. What we're looking for is what consumers' expectation is that those privacy protections apply regardless of the type of business that they're interacting with. But I think in order to do that, we do need to see some more nuanced thinking and more clever thinking about what that looks like for individual businesses. And I noticed there were some questions specifically about nonprofits, and coming from a nonprofit myself, I know how stretched resources are. So I think we really need to think about this proactively and not from a big stick kind of approach, but really from a how do we actually help uplift its compliance across the economy, and that's to the benefit of everybody.
Louis, you've got like a minute to add anything if you'd like to.
I won't comment on whether or not I'm clearly not from a small business. I'm not going to comment on whether or not my position on that or Emma's position on that. Other point I know is I am scared about how much my hairdresser knows about me, but maybe that's because I talk too much and I'm getting my hair cut. But, I think regardless of whether or not the exemption applies, I think there's some really tactical things that a small business can do to actually, again, it's, do you need to collect that information? Do you have someone who's thinking about whether or not that should be collected? Are you clear on where that data is stored? And it might be in a folder, it might not be on a hard drive, or it might not be in a server.
And Louis, I think
the other thing is the IIC already has some really good resources on some of that of a small business. Great. I think I'm unstable, sorry. But if you can hear me, the IIC already has some great resources as well that you can already pick up and go to that are really practicable and scalable for any size of business. So I'd recommend people go there.
Awesome. Well, I think we're coming to an end of this conversation. We can go on forever, actually, because there's so many other questions here, which please do reach out to ADMA, and we'll be happy to answer a lot of these questions for you, what we can. I think it's important what you said. With tight resources, tight budgets, there's a lot that has to be done. But I think a really important part is in trying to ensure that you train your team and upskill them to know. We don't expect marketers to be lawyers, right? What we do ask the marketers to know is what their responsibilities are at the front line so that they can ask the right questions of their compliance teams. So ADMA has a lot of resources which we can kind of available to members to kind of to help kind of understand what your responsibilities are. But please talk to your compliance teams, get across this. The changes are coming. They are complex and we're all working through it together. And I think we're in for a very interesting time. The way I treat this is there's somewhat of an amnesty for marketers here, somewhat, where we have an opportunity to kind of reset our data practices, to kind of take a look at our businesses, to ask our businesses to invest in this area so that we can clean it up, to use the data in a responsible way to provide the customer with an experience that they actually have come to expect of our brands, and to build up the digital trust of all of our brands in what is becoming fast a digital economy. So I would really like to thank both Kate and Louis for their time and experience and everything that they've shared with us today. I found it a really fascinating conversation. Thank you all of you for these questions. We'll try and come back to you, but I think we've got a poll question, because that's what we do, right? We're going to ask a poll. And your question is, has your marketing team been actively preparing for the changes that are coming for privacy? And this is your team, your marketing team, because I'm sure every business has got their compliance teams across it, but how much is your marketing team currently doing? And I hope that I hope this conversation and the presentation, as you know, the presentation there had to race through because we couldn't really go through a lot. But if you would like to, please get in touch with ADMA if you'd like to kind of go through that, especially as members, if that's something that you'd like us to kind of go through with you and your teams, a little bit more detail where I can take a breath in between each slide and between each point. Be happy to do that. And don't know how long we've still got with giving everyone with the poll. Okay. I think we are, most of you, come on, the last couple of you. Let's put it in. Let's put in these results. We've got to lift up some of the results here. On one end of the spectrum is actually not looking great. Okay, unless everybody else that is left to answer this poll is coming in with their teams being thoroughly prepared, I have to say, the results are showing that teams are not prepared, or they're just slightly prepared. So I hope this has given you an opportunity to kind of think about what it is your team can start doing. There's a lot that can be done. We don't have to wait for the exact wording. Okay, the exact wording will possibly matter most to the lawyers, but as marketers, we can start preparing right now to give our consumers that trust again, and connect them back with brands. Thank you both, Kate and Louis, for your time and attention today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Guys, that was an awesome session. For anyone that's still on the session, basically today is all about preparing for the privacy reforms. So what we'd like you to do is have a look at some of the avenues that you can take to get your teams prepared. One of the things you can do is attend the privacy and compliance course on Tuesday, the 6th of August. It's 2 half days with Sala, and you'll discover a wealth of information over those 2 half days. The other opportunity is custom in-house training, where a member of the ADMA regulatory team can train your team based on your specific business needs. That's an amazing opportunity if you wanted something a little bit more bespoke. And over the next coming days, you'll receive ADMA's preparing for privacy reform information sheet, which will be sent your way. So keep your eye on your inbox. There were a few questions around the slides and the information that was shared in this session. So if anyone would like to access the on-demand webinar, that will be available for ADMA members. And on the topic of ADMA membership, if you would like to become an ADMA member, that is your fast track to getting regulatory knowledge, support and advice. And yeah, it's definitely something to have in your corner with these privacy reforms on the horizon. And then above all, if you guys could please give us your feedback on this webinar, let us know how we can improve. All these links are being shared in the chat, so you'll be able to go through and have a look at all of those. So we'll leave this screen open for another couple of minutes until we see everyone drop out. Have a great day, everyone, and thank you for attending.